Hello, Internet. Your old pal Doc Awesome is finally back with part 3 of the belt-fed beat-em-up series. Sorry for the delay on this one, but I recently moved and had to rebuild my entire studio in a new place. Now everything is finally up and running, I can bring you the conclusion to this series. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, go check those out first. In this video, we're finally going to examine in detail the River City Ramifications. What influence and impact did it have on the games that followed in its bloody bootprints? River City Ransom is one of my favorite games of all time, for any system, and one of the best beat-em-ups ever made. Although released back in 1989, just a year after Double Dragon, its design was already years ahead of its contemporaries, and also most of the games released in the 2 decades that followed. It had what you would expect from the genre: the side-scrolling close-quarters combat, the large cast of enemies, a wide variety of weapons, and multiple boss battles. River City Ransom not only improved on all of these points, but also added tons of innovations other beat-em-ups, or any other video games at all, wouldn't bother to copy for years. The setup is classic. Ryan's girlfriend Cindy has been kidnapped by an evil villain named Slick, so Ryan and his best friend Alex must punch and kick their way through the gangs of River City to rescue her. There are 9 different gangs on the streets, and each has its own unique behaviors and attack patterns. While the mob is relentlessly aggressive and likes to use weapons, the generic dudes are pushovers who will sometimes flee in fear if you give one of their friends a good trouncing. The game takes place in an open world with a non-linear narrative. You can freely wander from one end of town to the other as long as you can stay alive. There's an RPG-style progression system that allows your character to level up various stats by purchasing items throughout the town. The food restores your health, but will also boost different stats. The game doesn't tell you what any of the items do, so visiting every shop and trying a little bit of everything is the only way to learn what you need to become more formidable. I can't think of another beat-em-up from that age where exploration is even a thing, let alone important. Unlike its contemporaries, you actually had to learn how to play River City Ransom. Simply killing everyone on the screen wasn't enough to win. But the longer you play, the stronger you become, allowing the game to unfold like a real story where characters grow and change over time. Eventually, the intimidating boss that was your gatekeeper in the early game will become a complete pushover against your suite of awesome new special moves, backed up by some very impressive stats. If that all sounds familiar, it's because it also describes the trajectory of most major game franchises over the last 20 years. But River City Ransom stapled an open-world RPG onto a totally unrelated genre way back in 1989. Now, everyone is doing it. They're attaching leveling and loot mechanics to everything from first-person shooters to puzzle games nowadays. Almost any major series still going has had at least one open-world entry if it hasn't transitioned entirely, like Red Dead Redemption or Assassin's Creed. Even games without open worlds try to fake it with multiple large interconnected maps or an endless torrent of procedurally generated content. Bethesda games do both. Long after you've finished all of its hundreds of hours of authored quests, Skyrim will keep making up random ones just to keep you busy. But unlike many modern games, River City Ransom never feels bloated or stretched thin. There are no pointless fetch quests or collectibles to hunt down. The only gates to your progress are the boss fights. All of the mini-bosses in an area must be defeated before the gang's boss will appear and fight you. But, for the most part, you can take them in any order you please. Defeat a gang boss and he'll tell you where to find the next one. Once all the bosses have been defeated, River City High School will open so you can finally have your ultimate showdown with Simon? I thought Slick was the villain. Well, where is he? Is Slick just Simon's nickname? I found this very confusing as a kid. On top of everything else, River City Ransom also solved the most tedious problem of the genre: the stingy continue economy. If you should fall on the mean streets, you don't have to start over from scratch. You go back to the last shopping center you visited, minus half your money. There's still a punishment for failure, but it doesn't needlessly waste the player's time and frustrate the fun out of the game. Most contemporary games have accepted this approach as standard, doing away with lives and continues completely, allowing players infinite mistakes with limited suffering. But River City Ransom did not perform well in the US, even as it earned accolades from critics for its excellent craftsmanship and charming art style. The passage of time relegated it to a cult classic that was fondly remembered, but had little influence on the next 2 decades of the beat-em-up. It's quite baffling, really. Beat-em-ups never had a problem with a little friendly plagiarism between competitors, and everything they needed to move the genre forward was contained in that little 8-bit cartridge. But it went ignored, selling so poorly that the other games in the series to follow were never translated for English-speaking audiences. Hell, I never knew River City Ransom was part of a bigger series until I went down a random Wikipedia hole a few years ago. And not only did we not get those games, hardly any of the ones we did get learned anything at all from this masterpiece. Even the game's own developer, Technos, took none of these lessons into their other series, Double Dragon. Fortunately for the genre as a whole, that would eventually change. After a dearth of titles in the early 2000s, the cult of River City began a revival of the belt-fed beat-em-up. Developers that grew up playing this game were finally making games of their own, and they had learned all that River City had to teach them. The first game to really give me flashbacks was 2010's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. The pixelated art style and combat mechanics are clearly inspired by River City Ransom, which had no small amount of influence on the source material itself. Ever wonder why Scott's enemies turn into piles of coins when defeated? Because Brian Lee O'Malley definitely played a lot of River City Ransom. The Scott Pilgrim game is an effusive love letter to video games as a whole, and the beat-em-up genre in particular, full of fun references and Easter eggs. And it features an awesome soundtrack by chiptune legends Anamanaguchi. In my humble opinion, the game is a more accurate adaptation of the comics than the movie it was released to promote. So it's a real shame this game has been delisted and there's no way to legally download and play it anymore, even if you bought it with real money. No, you're still upset. Even 2012's parody/revival Double Dragon Neon stole a few cues, sprinkling in a small selection of stores where you can buy and upgrade tapes, which provide perks and special moves for your character. The American version of River City Ransom got 2 different sequels decades later. 2017's River City Ransom Underground takes place 20 years after the original, giving you a sizable suite of characters to choose in your fight against the escaped Slick and his minions. This plays a lot like what I imagine a sequel on the Super Nintendo would have been like. It captures the charm of the old art style, but gives it a fresh coat of paint. The map and roster of enemies have been expanded, while the fighting system gets an upgrade allowing for more in-depth combat without becoming overly complicated. The sense of humor is perfectly preserved, and even adds a new layer of meta jokes about just how weird it is to live in a video game city. Seriously, why is everyone always fighting, all the time, everywhere? How do people ever get to work on time in River City with gangs always brawling in the streets? The one thing River City Ransom Underground does terribly is quest design. The main story is obtuse and difficult to follow. Even if you get a marker showing you where to go, you won't know what to do when you get there. So you will go there to trigger the next story event, fail, and try again in the hopes that you've divined the very specific but entirely unexplained thing the game wants you to do next. Instead of fighting, the point of most beat-em-up games, most of these missions require you to masterfully execute on the game's least fun mechanics. Fetch quests, escort missions, precision platforming. None of these are a challenge, they're just frustratingly difficult because the game wasn't designed for moving quickly across the screen, jumping, or avoiding combat while carrying a fragile object. The combat system is the best part of the whole game, but apparently nobody told the quest designer because they strive to evade it until the final act of the story. I'm utterly baffled by this design choice. If you can explain it, drop some knowledge in the comments. 2019's River City Girls was more of a spiritual successor that flipped the script of the original. This time, the boys have been kidnapped, and it's up to their beloved girlfriends to rescue them. The art style has a decidedly more anime flavor, but still pixelated to give it that classic video game feel. Since all of the characters got redesigned and kept their original names from the Japanese version, I was a little confused at first, but no familiarity with the previous games is required to have a good time with this one. Misako and Kyoko have some pretty hilarious best friend banter, and they encounter a variety of intriguingly weird characters on their quest. At times, it even betrays a metafictional edge, with Kyoko wondering aloud as they fight their way through a mall why everyone in their town is always so violent. You can level up your character and unlock new special moves, but you don't have nearly as much control over your build. While you have stats, there is very little you can do to alter them, as items bought in shops only bestow their bonuses once before becoming simple health recovery items. There are accessories you can equip to buff certain abilities or stats, but none of them ever significantly altered the way the game plays. The playable characters do have very different fighting styles, and that's where the replay value can be found. Although it is pretty weird to play as Kunio and Ricky on a quest to rescue Kunio and Ricky. People literally scream at you about being kidnapped to your face, and you're like, it's okay dude, I'm right here. 2020's Streets of Rage 4 didn't really borrow anything from River City Ransom. But as long as I'm talking about decades overdue sequels, it's worth mentioning that Streets of Rage 4 is totally awesome, and once again has an absolute banger of a soundtrack. You should definitely play it. But the game that reminded me the most of River City Ransom was the one I had just finished before returning to this old classic. 2015's Yakuza 0. It may have fancy modern graphics and a very complicated plot I'm not sure I could explain if I tried, but at its core it is still about a dude just trying to get some shopping done while roving packs of thugs randomly attack him on the street. Plus, one of the protagonists, Kiryu, bears a striking resemblance to River City's Kunio. If you told me Kunio was Kiryu's little cousin, I would totally believe you. Much like River City Ransom, there are lots of stats and tons of items to earn and buy that will affect them. As your character levels up, you will get access to new fighting styles and special moves, as well as passive bonuses, perks, accessories, and weapons. There are 3 different combat styles for both playable characters, Kiryu and Majima. Both can get as complex as top-tier fighting games, with combo chains, counter moves, and meter burns. But you can still spam your way to victory if you happen to find one combo you really like, or the only one you can perform reliably. Almost anything you find on the street can be used as a weapon, with often hilarious results. Beating up Yakuza thugs with a steaming hot pot of tea makes me laugh every time. The thing Yakuza 0 does better than all the other apostles of River City is all of the parts that are not fighting. The story and the characters are actually well developed, And there are plenty of amusing side quests with random weirdos you meet around town. This makes the setting of Yakuza 0 feel like a real place inhabited by living people, instead of just a backdrop for combat. It's also full of fun, diverting minigames. You can play Sega classics like Outrun in the arcades, go fishing, do a few rounds of mahjong, hit some balls at the batting cages, manage a hostess club, and of course, sing karaoke. It even has one of the most well-crafted and full-featured billiards games I have ever played, and it's just an extra included to help you waste more hours. If you're looking for a game full of content to keep you company through quarantine, Yakuza 0 is a gift that never stops giving. Finally, I jumped from 1980s Tokyo all the way back to River City in 19XX. It felt like I was playing the earliest blueprint for Yakuza 0, and in a way, that's exactly what I was doing. That's when the whole picture started to come into focus, and I understood why these games have had their hooks in me so deep for so long. In River City Ransom and all the games that followed it, there is one persistent theme. Triumph against overwhelming odds. There is never anything less than an army of goons standing in your way, and you will take them all head on with nothing but your fists, and maybe a few friends. If you're skilled and persistent, you can eventually beat the game despite your ludicrous disadvantage. I got the same exact rush from defeating Shibusawa at the end of Yakuza 0 that I did when I stomped Simon to save River City. The fact that some of these games practically cheat only makes the victory all the sweeter. In that way, beat-em-ups are similar to a real street fight. You pull whatever dirty tricks you have to in order to win. You might not be proud of your performance, but you're the one still standing, and that's all that counts. And that's why anytime some game gives me an excuse to punch pixelated punks across my screen, I'm willing to at least give it a try. Now that this long-dormant genre is enjoying a revival, especially among indie developers, I could not be happier. There are many new titles that I discovered in my research that I simply did not have time to play before making this video, and I'm looking forward to getting to every last one of them. If there are any gems out there you think I should definitely try, drop it in the comments. Well, that is it for this series, Belt-Fed Beat-em-Ups. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.